It all happened in a split second. One moment, my son Timmy was riding his bike, laughing under the warm afternoon sun. The next, there was a deafening screech of tires, a sickening thud, and the sound of his bike crumpling under the weight of Karen's SUV. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My kid, my 10-year-old son, was lying motionless on the pavement. I sprinted out of the garage, my legs moving faster than my brain could process what I was seeing. Timmy was curled up on the asphalt, clutching his leg, tears streaming down his face. His bike, his pride and joy, was now just a twisted heap of metal under Karen's front bumper. And then there she was, Karen, stepping out of her oversized white SUV like she had just parked at Target, not like she had just run over a child. "Oh my God," she said, but not in the way you'd expect someone to react after hitting a kid with their car. No panic, no concern, just pure exasperation. "Why was your son in the street? This is exactly why we have HOA rules." Her voice was shrill enough to shatter glass, and her tone, completely devoid of anything resembling remorse. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My son was lying there, clearly in pain, and this woman, this self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood, was already trying to shift the blame onto me. "Your kid shouldn't be playing outside unsupervised," she snapped, waving her phone around like it was some kind of magic wand that would make her guilt disappear. Neighbors started gathering because nothing draws a crowd faster than drama in suburbia. Some were whispering to each other, others were pulling out their phones to record, because let's face it, if there's one thing people love more than backyard BBQs in this country, it's capturing HOA Karen meltdowns on video. Now let me ask you something. What would you do if this were your kid lying there on the ground? Would you lose your mind? Would you give Karen a piece of your mind? Or would you stay calm and let her dig her own grave with every word that came out of her mouth? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I need to know I'm not crazy for wanting to throttle this woman right then and there. Anyway, back to Karen. As Timmy whimpered softly on the pavement and my neighbor Linda knelt down to check on him, bless her retired nurse heart, Karen decided that this was the perfect time to start lecturing me about HOA policies. "This is why we have rules," she said loudly enough for everyone within a 3-block radius to hear. "Kids shouldn't be allowed to play in the street. It's dangerous." "Dangerous? Lady, you're the danger. You're the one who came flying through our cul-de-sac like you were auditioning for NASCAR." But before I could even process how furious I was, Karen pulled out her phone and started dialing 911. That's right, she called the cops on me. Not because she hit my son with her car, but because she wanted to report me for negligence. At this point, I'm standing there in stunned silence while Linda tries to comfort Timmy, and another neighbor mutters something about how Karen drives like she's late for brunch every day. The crowd around us is growing by the minute, and everyone seems to have an opinion about what just happened. One guy pipes up and says he saw Karen blow through the stop sign at the entrance to our cul-de-sac earlier that day. Another neighbor chimes in about how she's always speeding through the neighborhood like she owns the place, which, considering she's HOA president, she probably thinks she does. But Karen wasn't backing down. Oh no. She doubled down on her victim act as soon as the police arrived, which didn't take long because apparently they've dealt with enough HOA drama around here to know when Karen's involved, things are about to get messy. "Officer," she exclaimed before they even had a chance to ask what happened. "This man lets his child play unsupervised in the street. It's unsafe. And now look what happened." She gestured dramatically toward Timmy like he was some kind of exhibit in her case against me. The officers looked at Timmy, still clutching his leg, and then at Karen's SUV with its dented bumper and mangled bike underneath it. One of them raised an eyebrow and asked her point blank, "Ma'am, were you speeding?" Karen stammered something about how she was within the limit and how it's not her fault if kids are riding their bikes where they shouldn't be. That's when Linda stepped forward like an absolute champion and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I saw everything. She was speeding through the cul-de-sac without even slowing down." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder as more neighbors chimed in with their own stories about Karen's reckless driving habits. You could see her confidence start to crack as people began siding against her. Her face turned redder than a stop sign, which is ironic considering she doesn't seem to think those apply to her, and she started fumbling over her words. Meanwhile, Timmy was being loaded into an ambulance by paramedics who assured me it looked like just a broken leg, but that we should get x-rays done just in case. My heart broke seeing him like that, scared and hurt, but I also felt this burning anger bubbling up inside me because Karen wasn't done yet. She actually had the audacity to threaten legal action against me for damages to her car and claimed that I violated HOA policies by letting Timmy ride his bike near the street. At this point, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to laugh or scream, or maybe both. So there we were. My kid heading off to the hospital with a broken leg, my neighbors rallying behind me against Karen's nonsense, and Karen herself standing there acting like she was the victim in all of this. And let me tell you something. If there's one thing I've learned from living under an HOA dictatorship, it's that people like Karen don't back down easily. But here's what I want to know from you. If someone hit your kid with their car and then tried to blame you, how would you handle it? Let me know. I could use some advice because dealing with this woman is going to take every ounce of patience I have left. Alright, so the cops are here, the neighbors are buzzing, and Karen is still flapping her gums about how this is somehow my fault. Meanwhile, I'm standing there trying to keep my cool. But let me tell you, inside, I'm boiling. My kid's on his way to the hospital with a broken leg, and Karen's biggest concern seems to be whether her HOA presidency is still intact. You can't make this stuff up. The officers start taking statements, and it's like watching a bad reality show unfold in real time. Karen, of course, is front and center, talking over everyone like she's auditioning for the role of innocent suburban heroine. She's got her hands on her hips, her voice dripping with faux outrage as she says things like, "I was driving very carefully," and "This is why we need stricter HOA enforcement." Oh yeah, Karen, maybe we also need stricter enforcement on reckless drivers who think stop signs are optional. Now, here's where things get interesting. My neighbor Linda, you remember Linda, the retired nurse who saw the whole thing, steps up to give her statement. And let me tell you, Linda does not mess around. She looks the officer dead in the eye and says, "I saw Karen speeding through the cul-de-sac like she was late for a sale at Macy's. She didn't even slow down when she turned the corner." Boom. Mic drop. Karen's face turned so red I thought she was going to spontaneously combust right there in the street. She starts stammering about how Linda must have been mistaken because I always drive responsibly. Oh please, Karen. Responsible drivers don't leave skid marks on residential streets. But here's the kicker. Linda isn't the only one who saw what happened. Another neighbor, Bob, who's lived here for 20 years and knows everything that goes on in this neighborhood, chimes in. "She was definitely speeding," Bob says. "I've seen her do it before. She drives that SUV like it's a sports car." Now Karen's really squirming because when Bob speaks, people listen. He's basically the unofficial mayor of our cul-de-sac. At this point, it's clear that Karen's story is falling apart faster than a dollar store lawn chair. The officers start asking more pointed questions. "Ma'am, were you aware that this is a 15-mile-per-hour zone? And did you see the child before you hit him?" Karen tries to dodge these questions with vague answers like, "Well, I wasn't going that fast, and he came out of nowhere." But it's obvious she's grasping at straws. Meanwhile, I'm standing there thinking about all the times Karen has made my life miserable with her HOA nonsense. Like the time she fined me $75 because my trash cans were visible from the street for 10 minutes. Or the time she sent me a warning letter because my mailbox wasn't painted in an HOA-approved shade of beige. And now here she is, trying to paint herself as the victim after hitting my kid with her car? Oh no, not today. The officers finish taking statements and tell Karen they'll be filing an official report. They also suggest she might want to contact her insurance company because, surprise, she's probably going to be held liable for damages. You'd think this would shut her up, but nope. Karen doubles down. "I'm not paying for anything," she shrieks. "This wouldn't have happened if he hadn't been playing in the street. The HOA has rules against this kind of thing." She pulls out her phone and starts scrolling through what I can only assume is some kind of digital HOA Bible where every rule is highlighted and bookmarked for maximum pettiness. Now let me tell you something about HOAs. They're supposed to make neighborhoods better, keep things clean, maintain property values, but in reality, they're just power trips for people like Karen who have nothing better to do than police everyone else's lives. And trust me when I say Karen takes her role as HOA president very seriously. She once sent out a 5-page newsletter about proper lawn edging techniques. 5 pages. Who even reads that? Anyway, as Karen continues ranting about how this is all somehow my fault for not keeping Timmy locked inside like he's Rapunzel or something, one of the officers finally steps in and says, "Ma'am, regardless of HOA rules, you're responsible for following traffic laws." Boom again. It was beautiful, a moment of pure justice wrapped up in one simple sentence. But does Karen back down? Of course not. She starts arguing with the officer about how the real problem is parents like me who don't respect HOA guidelines. At this point, even some of her staunchest supporters in the neighborhood are starting to look embarrassed for her. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any crazier, Karen drops this gem. "I'm going to sue him for damages to my car." That's right. She wants to sue me for damages to her car. The same car that ran over my son's bike and nearly took him out in the process. I couldn't help myself. I laughed out loud. Not just a chuckle. A full-on belly laugh that startled everyone around me. "You're going to sue me?" I said between laughs. "For what? Existing? For having a kid who dared to ride his bike in his own neighborhood?" Karen glares at me like I've just insulted her entire family lineage and says, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Oh great, Karen has a lawyer now. Probably some poor soul who specializes in petty HOA disputes and has no idea what they're about to get dragged into. As things start winding down and people begin dispersing, one of my other neighbors, a guy named Rick who always seems to have a beer in his hand no matter what time of day it is, comes up to me and says, "Don't worry about Karen. She talks big, but she doesn't have a leg to stand on." Rick may not be a legal expert, but his words were oddly comforting. So there you have it. My son is on his way to recovery, thank God. Karen is plotting her next move, probably involving some kind of frivolous lawsuit, and I'm left wondering how we got here in the first place. All I know is this. If Karen thinks she can bully me into submission with her HOA nonsense and empty threats, she's got another thing coming. Because let me tell you something, I've dealt with enough HOA drama over the years to know one thing for sure. When it comes to people like Karen, you don't back down. You stand your ground, you fight fire with fire, and if necessary, you read every single page of those ridiculous HOA bylaws until you find something that works in your favor. And trust me, I'm just getting started. After Karen's Oscar-worthy meltdown in front of the cops, I thought things might calm down. You know, maybe she'd go home, stew in her own self-righteousness, and let the dust settle. But no, this is Karen we're talking about. The woman doesn't just live for drama. She thrives on it. And what does she do next? She escalates. Because of course she does. The very next morning, I wake up to find a certified letter sitting in my mailbox. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I see the words certified mail, I immediately brace myself for bad news. And sure enough, it's from Karen, or more specifically, from her lawyer. That's right. She wasn't bluffing about suing me. The letter accuses me of negligence, violating HOA rules, and, get this, emotional distress caused by the damage to her car. I read the letter twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Emotional distress? From a dented bumper? Lady, you hit my kid with your car. If anyone's entitled to emotional distress here, it's Timmy, and maybe me for having to deal with your nonsense. But here's where it gets even better. Karen claims that because Timmy was riding his bike unsupervised, I'm liable for all damages to her vehicle and any legal fees she incurs while pursuing this case. She even attached a copy of the HOA bylaws with a highlighted section about unsupervised minors engaging in unsafe activities. You know what wasn't highlighted? The part about following traffic laws in residential areas. Convenient. Huh? Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I've watched enough courtroom dramas to know when someone's grasping at straws. So instead of panicking, which is probably what Karen was hoping for, I decided to fight fire with fire. If Karen wanted to play the legal game, then fine. I'd play too. First things first, I needed evidence. So I spent the next few hours combing through my home security footage, the same cameras Karen once complained about because they were too visible and didn't match the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. And guess what I found? Clear as day footage of her speeding through the cul-de-sac at least 10 miles over the limit and blowing past the stop sign without even tapping the brakes. But wait, it gets better. As I'm reviewing the footage, I realize something else. Karen has been driving recklessly in our neighborhood for months. My cameras caught her doing everything from rolling through stop signs to nearly clipping a parked car while swerving around a trash truck. It was like watching a highlight reel of suburban chaos starring Karen and her SUV. Armed with this goldmine of evidence, I decided it was time to consult a professional. So I called up my buddy Dave, a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes and knows all the tricks people like Karen try to pull. Dave took one look at the footage and said, "Oh yeah, you've got her dead to rights. Music to my ears." Dave explained that not only could we counter Karen's lawsuit with our own claim for damages and negligence, but we could also challenge her authority as HOA president if we proved she was abusing her power or violating community standards. And let's be honest, Karen was practically begging for someone to knock her off her HOA throne. But before we went nuclear, Dave suggested we try mediation first. Give Karen a chance to back down gracefully before things got ugly. So we scheduled a meeting with Karen and her lawyer at Dave's office later that week. Now let me tell you something about Karen. She doesn't do graceful. She showed up to the mediation looking like she was ready for battle. Clipboard in hand, HOA bylaws tucked under her arm, and an expression that could curdle milk. Her lawyer, a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, sat beside her looking visibly uncomfortable. Dave started off by presenting our evidence. The security footage, witness statements from neighbors like Linda and Bob, and even a copy of the police report that clearly stated Karen was at fault for the accident. As he laid everything out on the table, Karen's face went through several stages of denial. First confusion, then indignation, and finally full-blown rage. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, slamming her clipboard down on the table. "Those cameras violate HOA guidelines. They shouldn't even be allowed." Yes, the classic Karen defense. If you don't like the evidence against you, attack its existence. Dave calmly pointed out that my cameras were perfectly legal and installed within HOA regulations. A fact Karen herself had confirmed in an email months ago when she begrudgingly approved them after trying and failing to impose additional restrictions. At this point, Karen started flailing around for excuses like a fish out of water. "The stop sign wasn't visible," she claimed. "It's obstructed by trees." Nice try, but my footage showed that not only was the stop sign perfectly visible, but Karen had driven past it so many times she probably could have done it blindfolded. Her lawyer, who clearly realized this was a losing battle, leaned over and whispered something to her. Whatever he said must have been good because suddenly Karen went quiet. For a moment, I thought she might actually back down. But then she pulled out her evidence. Printed copies of HOA violation notices she'd issued against me over the years. "This man has repeatedly violated community standards," she declared triumphantly. "Trash cans left out overnight. Grass longer than 3 inches. A mailbox painted in an unauthorized color." Oh no, Karen had gone full petty mode. Dave didn't even blink. He calmly explained that none of these alleged violations had any bearing on the current case and reminded Karen that she was the one being accused of negligence, not me. But instead of admitting defeat, Karen doubled down again. "I'm not stepping down as HOA president," she hissed through gritted teeth. "And I'm not paying for his son's medical bills or damages to his bike. This is harassment." "Harassment? Lady, you hit my kid with your car. If anything qualifies as harassment here, it's your relentless campaign against anyone who dares defy your HOA dictatorship." By the end of the meeting, it was clear that mediation wasn't going anywhere. Karen refused to budge on anything, not liability for Timmy's injuries or damages to his bike, and insisted on taking this case to court if necessary. So there we were, two sides locked in suburban warfare with no end in sight. But here's what Karen didn't realize. While she was busy clinging to her clipboard and screaming about trash cans and mailboxes, I was quietly building a case that would expose every shady thing she'd ever done as HOA president. And trust me when I say there were plenty of skeletons hiding in her beige-colored closet. Because if there's one thing people like Karen don't understand about revenge stories, it's that sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous. Alright, so after that disaster of a mediation session, I realized something very important. Karen wasn't just stubborn. She was delusional. She genuinely believed she was untouchable, like some kind of suburban dictator ruling over her HOA kingdom with an iron fist and a clipboard. But you know what they say, pride comes before the fall. And oh, was I ready to make her fall. The first thing I did was dig into the HOA bylaws. Now, I know what you're thinking. Mike, why would you willingly read through HOA bylaws? That sounds like torture. And you'd be right, it was torture. Those things are written in the driest, most soul-sucking legalese imaginable. But here's the thing about HOAs. They love rules. They love them so much that they bury themselves in them. And when you dig deep enough, you're bound to find something they're doing wrong. And boy, did I find something. Turns out, Karen had been running the HOA like her own personal fiefdom for years. She'd been approving fines without proper votes, using HOA funds for administrative expenses that were suspiciously vague, and even skipping mandatory annual audits. Oh yeah, Karen wasn't just a bad driver. She was a bad president. And now I had the receipts to prove it. But I wasn't done yet. Oh no, the Karen wanted to play dirty. Then so would I. So I started talking to my neighbors, the same people she'd been terrorizing with her ridiculous rules and petty fines. It didn't take long to find out that pretty much everyone had a Karen horror story. There was Bob, who got fined $100 because his lawn ornaments weren't aesthetically pleasing. There was Linda, who got a warning letter because her garden hose was visible from the street. And then there was Rick, the guy who always has a beer in his hand. He got hit with a $200 fine because his truck was parked an inch over the HOA-approved boundary line on his driveway. An inch. Karen had been nickel-and-diming this neighborhood for years, and people were fed up. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I organized a neighborhood meeting. Not an official HOA meeting. Oh no, Karen would have shut that down faster than she runs stop signs. But an unofficial gathering at my house where people could vent their frustrations and share their stories. And let me tell you, it was like opening the floodgates. People came out of the woodwork with complaints about Karen. One guy brought an entire folder of violation notices he'd received over the years. Everything from improperly trimmed hedges to unauthorized holiday decorations. Another neighbor said Karen had once tried to fine her for having too many guests at a birthday party because it disrupted the peace. By the end of the night, we had enough material to write a book called The Chronicles of Karen. Tales from the HOA. But here's where things really started to get interesting. One of my neighbors, a quiet guy named Steve who works in accounting, mentioned something that made everyone sit up and pay attention. He said he'd noticed some discrepancies in the HOA's financial reports over the past few years. Things like inflated expenses and missing funds. Now, I'm no accountant, but even I know that when money starts disappearing from an HOA budget, it's not because someone accidentally bought too many bags of mulch. So Steve offered to take a closer look at the HOA's finances, and what he found was, well, let's just say it wasn't good news for Karen. Turns out, Karen had been using HOA funds for all kinds of questionable expenses. Things like office supplies that included designer pens and luxury planners, community improvement projects that never actually happened, and even a $500 charge for what she labeled as consulting fees. Consulting fees? Lady, who are you consulting with? The ghost of suburbia past? Armed with this new information, we decided it was time to take action. So we filed a formal petition to call for a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. A fancy way of saying we wanted her removed as HOA president. And let me tell you, getting signatures for that petition was easier than selling Girl Scout cookies outside a grocery store. People were practically lining up to sign their names. But here's where things got tricky. According to the bylaws, which I now knew better than the back of my hand, we needed to present our petition at an official HOA meeting. And guess who controlled those meetings? That's right, Karen. So we came up with a plan. A plan so devious, so cunning, that even Karen wouldn't see it coming. First, we made sure our petition met all the requirements outlined in the bylaws. Because if there's one thing Karen loves more than her SUV, it's rules. Then we submitted it through all the proper channels. Certified mail to the HOA board members, email copies sent directly to Karen, because she checks her inbox religiously, and even hard copies delivered to her doorstep by yours truly. Next, we rallied as many neighbors as possible to attend the upcoming HOA meeting, the one where we'd be presenting our petition. And let me tell you, this wasn't your average boring HOA meeting where people argue about fence heights and paint colors. No, sir, this was shaping up to be the event of the year. By the time the meeting rolled around, word had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People showed up in droves, some carrying signs that said things like, "Down with Karen," and "No more dictatorship." It was like a suburban revolution. Karen walked into that meeting looking smug as ever, clipboard in hand, hair perfectly coiffed, but you could tell she wasn't expecting what came next. As soon as the meeting started, Steve stood up and presented our petition along with all the evidence we'd gathered against her. Everything from her reckless spending habits to her abuse of power as president. He even handed out copies of his financial analysis so everyone could see just how badly she'd mismanaged our community funds. Karen tried to defend herself, of course she did, but it was like watching someone try to bail water out of a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The more she talked, the angrier people got. By the end of her speech, if you can even call it that, half the room was booing while the other half demanded her immediate resignation. And then came the vote. A simple yes or no on whether Karen should remain as president. The results? Overwhelmingly in favor of removing her from office. As Karen stormed out of that meeting clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of lifeline, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Not just for myself or for Timmy, but for everyone in our neighborhood who'd ever been victimized by her reign of terror. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about one bad driver or one petty lawsuit. It was about standing up to bullies and proving that, even in suburbia, justice can prevail. Karen's reign as HOA president was officially over, and let me tell you, the neighborhood was buzzing. It was like we'd collectively defeated the final boss of some suburban video game. People were smiling at each other in the streets, waving to neighbors they hadn't talked to in years, and even Rick, the guy who's always got a beer in his hand, mowed his lawn for the first time in months. The air felt lighter, like we'd finally exorcised the HOA demon that had been haunting us. But here's the thing about Karen. She doesn't go down quietly. Oh no, if you thought she was bad as HOA president, you should see her as a disgraced ex-president with a vendetta. It's like she took all the energy she used to micromanage our lives and redirected it into plotting her comeback. And trust me, she wasn't subtle about it. The first sign that Karen wasn't done came just days after the vote. I woke up to find a new certified letter in my mailbox, because apparently Karen thinks certified mail is the ultimate power move. This time, it wasn't from her lawyer. It was from Karen herself. She'd written a formal complaint accusing me of slandering her reputation during the HOA meeting and demanded an apology to restore her dignity. Restore her dignity? Lady, you lost that the moment you tried to fine Bob for his lawn ornaments. I ignored the letter because, honestly, what was I supposed to do? Write back and say, "Dear Karen, I'm sorry you got caught being terrible at your job?" Yeah, that wasn't happening. But Karen didn't stop there. Oh no, she started showing up at every public HOA event, even ones she had no business attending, just to stir up trouble. Take the neighborhood block party, for example. Now that Karen was out of office, people decided it was safe to bring back our annual block party, a tradition she'd canceled years ago because it encouraged rowdy behavior. Translation: people were having fun, and Karen couldn't stand it. So there we were, kids running around with ice cream cones, adults grilling burgers and drinking beers, music playing. It was perfect. And then Karen showed up. She marched into the middle of the party like she owned the place, wearing her signature blazer and clutching a folder labeled Community Concerns. She didn't even bother grabbing a plate of food or saying hello. Just went straight into lecturing people about noise levels and trash disposal. "This is exactly why I implemented stricter policies as president," she shouted over the music. "You're all creating a mess that will take weeks to clean up." Rick, bless his heart, walked over with a burger in one hand and a beer in the other and said, "Karen, why don't you relax and have some food? You're not president anymore. You don't have to worry about this stuff." And let me tell you, the look on Karen's face? Priceless. She glared at Rick like he just insulted her entire family lineage and stormed off muttering something about irresponsible leadership. But Karen's antics didn't stop at public events. Oh no, She started targeting people individually, sending passive-aggressive emails about maintaining community standards, and leaving anonymous notes on doors whenever she thought someone's lawn looked unkempt. Everyone knew it was her because, let's be honest, who else writes notes in cursive on monogram stationery? And then came her piece de resistance, an attempt to regain control of the HOA by running for treasurer during the next election cycle. That's right, Karen wasn't aiming for president this time. She wanted treasurer. Why? Because treasurers control the money, and Karen loves nothing more than controlling things. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to an HOA election meeting, but let me tell you, it's not exactly riveting entertainment. Most of the time, people show up just to vote quickly so they can go home and watch TV or mow their lawns or do literally anything else. But this meeting? Oh man, it was packed. Word had spread that Karen was trying to worm her way back into power, and nobody wanted to miss the show. Karen arrived looking smug as ever, clipboard in hand, of course, hair perfectly coiffed, and immediately launched into her campaign speech. She talked about how she had dedicated years of service to improving our community and how she was uniquely qualified to handle our finances because of her extensive experience. Extensive experience? Lady, your idea of financial management is buying designer pens with HOA funds. But here's where things got interesting. Steve, the quiet accountant who exposed Karen's shady spending habits, decided he'd had enough. He stood up right in the middle of Karen's speech and said, "Karen, can you explain why $500 in HOA funds were spent on consulting fees last year? Who were you consulting with?" The room went dead silent. Karen stammered something about how those fees were for professional advice related to community improvements, which is funny because none of those improvements ever happened. Steve wasn't buying it, and neither were we. Another neighbor chimed in. "What about those office supplies you bought? Why did we spend $300 on planners?" And then Linda jumped in. "And what happened to the money for tree trimming? My trees are still overgrown." It was like watching a courtroom drama unfold right there in the HOA meeting room. Karen tried to defend herself, of course she did, but every excuse she gave just made things worse. By the end of her speech, if you can even call it that, people were openly laughing at her. When it came time to vote for treasurer, Karen didn't stand a chance. Steve won by a landslide, not just because he was qualified, but because everyone trusted him not to use HOA funds for luxury pens or imaginary consulting fees. As Karen left that meeting clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of security blanket, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Not just for myself, but for everyone in our neighborhood who'd ever been victimized by her nonsense. Because here's the thing about Karen. She may have lost every shred of power she once had, but she'll never admit defeat. And honestly, that makes victory even sweeter. So now life is finally back to normal, or as normal as it gets when you live in a neighborhood with an ex-HOA president who still thinks she runs the place. But hey, I'll take passive-aggressive notes over fines any day. And if Karen ever tries another comeback, well, let's just say I'll be ready. After Karen's humiliating defeat at the HOA election, you'd think she'd finally take the hint and just, I don't know, fade into the background like a bad memory. But no, Karen doesn't know how to quit. If anything, losing her bid for treasurer seemed to light a fire under her, like she was determined to prove that she could still make everyone's lives miserable even without an official title. And let me tell you, she gave it her all. The first sign that Karen wasn't done came in the form of a new neighborhood newsletter. Now, normally the HOA sends out a monthly newsletter with updates about things like community events, maintenance schedules, and reminders about trash pickup. But this was something else entirely. It was a special edition newsletter, written, printed, and distributed by Karen herself. And it was basically one long rant about how the neighborhood was falling apart without her leadership. She called it the voice of reason, which is hilarious because Karen wouldn't recognize reason if it hit her in the face. The whole thing was filled with thinly veiled jabs at everyone who had dared to oppose her. She didn't name names, but it was painfully obvious who she was talking about. For example, there was a section titled "The Dangers of Financial Mismanagement," where she accused certain individuals, Steve, of being unqualified to handle HOA funds. Then there was a whole paragraph about how some residents, definitely me, were setting a bad example by failing to enforce basic safety standards for their children. And let's not forget the part where she claimed that the block party had been a disaster because of rowdy behavior and excessive noise. It was like reading a manifesto from someone who thinks they're the main character in a soap opera. But here's the kicker. Karen didn't just leave these newsletters in people's mailboxes like a normal person. Oh no, she taped them to our front doors with packing tape. Do you know how annoying it is to scrape packing tape off your door? It's like she wanted to leave a permanent mark just to remind us that she's still here. Now, most people just rolled their eyes and tossed the newsletter in the trash. But I couldn't let it go. Not this time. Because here's the thing. Karen wasn't just being annoying. She was spreading lies. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's someone trying to rewrite history to make themselves look good. So I decided to fight back. Not with another newsletter, because let's be honest, nobody wants to read that, but with cold, hard facts. I went through every HOA document I could find. Meeting minutes, financial reports, violation notices, and put together a timeline of all the ways Karen had mismanaged our community during her time as president. Then I shared it with my neighbors, not in some passive-aggressive way like Karen would have done, but in an open and transparent way that let people see the truth for themselves. And you know what? It worked. People started talking, sharing their own stories about Karen and calling her out on social media whenever she tried to stir up drama. Even Rick got in on the action, posting a picture of his infamous $200 fine for parking an inch over his driveway line with the caption, "Never forget." But Karen wasn't about to go down without a fight. She started doubling down on her tactics, writing more newsletters, leaving more notes on doors, and even hosting unofficial community meetings at her house where she tried to rally support for her cause. The problem was, nobody showed up. Well, except for one guy who thought it was a potluck and left as soon as he realized there wasn't any food. At this point, you'd think Karen would have realized that she was fighting a losing battle. But instead of backing off, she decided to escalate things even further by filing yet another lawsuit. This time against Steve and the entire HOA board for defamation and wrongful removal from office. That's right. Karen actually thought she could sue her way back into power. Now, I'm no legal expert, but even I knew this lawsuit didn't stand a chance. For starters, everything we'd said about Karen was backed up by evidence. Evidence that she herself had provided through years of ridiculous fines and questionable spending habits. And secondly, well, let's just say that suing an entire neighborhood isn't exactly a great way to win people over. The case dragged on for months, because of course it did. And during that time, Karen became even more unbearable than usual. She started showing up at HOA meetings again, not as a participant, but as an observer who sat in the back row taking furious notes on everything that was said. She also started sending out weekly emails accusing Steve and the other board members of corruption and incompetence. But here's where things got really interesting. During one of these meetings, Steve announced that he'd uncovered even more discrepancies in the HOA's financial records. Discrepancies that pointed directly back to Karen. Turns out those consulting fees weren't just vague. They were completely fabricated. The money had been funneled into a personal account that Karen had set up under the name Community Improvement Fund. And if that wasn't bad enough, she'd also been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses like dry cleaning and car repairs. When this news came out, it was like dropping a bombshell in the middle of the meeting. People were furious, not just because Karen had been stealing from us, but because she'd spent years pretending to be some kind of moral authority while doing it. Even Rick looked mad, and Rick never gets mad. Karen tried to deny everything at first, claiming that there must have been some kind of mistake. But when Steve presented copies of bank statements showing exactly where the money had gone, well, let's just say her argument fell apart pretty quickly. The fallout from this revelation was swift and brutal. Not only did Karen lose her lawsuit, obviously, but she also found herself facing criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. And while I'd love to say that justice was served swiftly and decisively, the truth is it took months of legal wrangling before anything actually happened. But eventually, Karen got what was coming to her. She ended up pleading guilty to multiple charges and agreeing to pay restitution. Not just to the HOA, but also to individual residents who'd been affected by her actions. And while I can't say I'm happy about everything we went through as a neighborhood, I will say this. Seeing Karen finally held accountable for her actions, that felt pretty damn good. Because at the end of the day, sometimes revenge isn't about getting even. It's about making sure people like Karen never get away with their nonsense again. Alright, so Karen finally got what was coming to her. After months of drama, lawsuits, and enough passive-aggressive notes to wallpaper an entire house, she was officially done. Pleading guilty to embezzlement and fraud was the cherry on top of her downfall. And let me tell you, the neighborhood felt like it had been reborn. It was like we'd collectively survived a natural disaster, except instead of hurricanes or earthquakes, it was Karen. Life started returning to normal, or at least as normal as it gets in a neighborhood that's still recovering from years of HOA tyranny. The first big change? People actually started talking to each other again. It's amazing how much friendlier folks get when they're no longer living under constant threat of fines for things like unauthorized mailbox colors or improperly trimmed hedges. Rick even threw a barbecue to celebrate Karen's departure, complete with burgers, beers, and a playlist that included Highway to Hell, a subtle nod to her driving habits. But here's the thing about Karen. Even when she's gone, she leaves behind a legacy of chaos. For weeks after her guilty plea, we were still finding little remnants of her reign, like old violation notices stuffed in drawers or outdated HOA newsletters buried under piles of junk mail. It was like trying to clean up after a tornado that had been fueled by pettiness and bad decisions. And then there were the repairs. Oh man, the repairs. Turns out, Karen's community improvement projects had been nothing more than smoke and mirrors. The HOA budget was a mess, the landscaping was neglected, and half the streetlights hadn't been fixed in years because she'd spent the maintenance funds on designer pens and dry cleaning. Steve, the accountant-turned-HOA hero, had his work cut out for him trying to untangle the financial mess she'd left behind. But you know what? We managed. Slowly but surely, we rebuilt our neighborhood into something better, something stronger. And while it wasn't perfect, because let's be honest, no HOA ever is, it felt like we were finally moving forward instead of being stuck in Karen's endless cycle of nonsense. As for Karen herself, well, she disappeared from the neighborhood not long after her guilty plea. Rumor has it she moved to another suburb across town, a place where nobody knows her name or her history with embezzlement. And while part of me hopes she learned her lesson and decided to turn over a new leaf, another part of me suspects she's already terrorizing some poor new neighborhood with her clipboard and monogram stationery. But here's the funny thing. Even though Karen is gone, she still pops up in conversation every now and then, like an urban legend or cautionary tale. Remember when Karen tried to find Bob for his lawn ornaments? Someone will say during a block party, and everyone will laugh because yeah, we remember. Or, can you believe she spent HOA funds on luxury planners? And just like that, Karen becomes a punchline, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked in suburban America. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way, because if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's that standing up to bullies, even ones with fancy titles and clipboards, is always worth it. Sure, it wasn't easy dealing with Karen's nonsense day in and day out, but in the end, we won. Justice prevailed. And now we can finally enjoy our neighborhood without worrying about whether our trash cans are visible from the street. Oh, and speaking of trash cans, guess who finally painted his mailbox an unauthorized color just for fun? That's right, me. It's bright red now, a bold middle finger to Karen's beige-loving legacy. And every time I see it, I smile because I know she'd hate it. So yeah, that's my story. A wild ride through suburban warfare that started with my kid getting hit by Karen's SUV and ended with her downfall as HOA president/embezzler extraordinaire. And while I wouldn't wish this kind of drama on anyone, I have to admit, it makes for one heck of a story. Now before I wrap things up, let me ask you something. Have you ever dealt with someone like Karen? Maybe not an HOA dictator, but someone who thought they could control everything around them just because they had a little bit of power? If you have, drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Or if you've ever had issues with your HOA, because let's be real, who hasn't? Share your experience too. Let's commiserate together. And hey, if you enjoyed this story or found yourself laughing at Karen's ridiculousness even just a little bit, do me a favor, hit that like button Share this video with your friends so they can laugh at suburban drama too. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories about life in the trenches of everyday chaos. Trust me, I've got plenty more where this came from. Thanks for sticking around and listening to my tale of revenge and redemption. And remember, never underestimate the power of a determined dad armed with security footage and an accountant friend named Steve.